Welcome to Be Wise and Relax. Tonight, we are going to slow down together and spend some time with one of the strangest and most beautiful threads in all of Western thought. A thread that runs from the temples of an ancient world, through the workshops of medieval alchemists, into the libraries of Renaissance Florence, and all the way up to the quiet desk of the man who wrote the laws of motion. We are going to follow the story of a single short text called the Emerald Tablet, and the tradition that grew around it, the tradition we now call Hermeticism. And we are going to do it gently, slowly, with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. So before anything else, let me say this plainly. You do not need to know anything about Hermeticism to listen tonight. You do not need to have read a single old book, or to believe in any of it, or to remember a single name when you wake. There will be names, yes, and dates, and strange Latin phrases that have echoed down the centuries, but they will arrive softly, one at a time, and I will explain each one as it comes. Nothing here asks anything of you. There is nothing to figure out, nowhere else to be. This is simply a slow walk through an old and curious story told in the dark, meant to carry you down into sleep. And if you would like to, before we begin, you might leave a small note in the comments. Just tell me what time it is where you are and where in the world you happen to be listening from tonight. It is a quiet pleasure, knowing that somewhere a lamp is off and a person is settling in a city I will never see, at an hour that is not my own. We are scattered all across the night, you and I and everyone else listening, and yet here we are in the same small pool of voice and quiet. So if it feels right, say where you are, and then let it go. Now, take a slow, deep breath. In, through the nose, gently, and out, slower still, letting the day go with it. Feel the weight of your body where it rests, the pillow under your head, the blanket over you. Wherever you are, let yourself settle in. There is no hurry now. The story will keep its own slow pace, and you can drift in and out of it as you please. If you miss a sentence, it does not matter. If you fall asleep before the end, that is the whole point. Thank you for joining me here at Be Wise and Relax. Let us begin. I want to start, oddly enough, not in ancient Egypt and not with a god, but with a man you have almost certainly heard of. Isaac Newton, the one who explained why an apple falls, the one who gave us the laws of motion, the architect of so much of the modern world that we now simply call physics. Picture him, if you like, late in the evening by candlelight, a quill in his hand, and imagine that the thing he is copying out, word by careful word, is not a calculation about gravity and not a diagram of the planets. It is a single short paragraph, an old cryptic paragraph, translated and recopied across more than 1,000 years before it ever reached his desk. And the first line he writes in his own hand, in his own English, reads like this: "'Tis true without lying, certain and most true." That sentence survives. We can still see it. Newton's translation of this strange little text exists today as a manuscript kept among his papers, and scholars have read it and studied it and put it online for anyone to see. "'Tis true without lying, certain and most true." It is the opening line of the Emerald Tablet, the very text whose story we are following tonight. And the man copying it out was not some forgotten dabbler at the edges of history. It was Newton himself, the same mind, the same hand. Here is the part that surprises almost everyone when they first hear it. Newton wrote more about alchemy and more about theology and the hidden meanings of old texts than he ever wrote about physics. Far more, in fact. We tend to remember him only for the gravity and the mathematics because that is the part of him the modern world chose to keep. But the man himself spent a great portion of his life bent over alchemical recipes and ancient mystical writings, chasing a kind of knowledge we have mostly forgotten he wanted. the emerald tablet was one of the things he chased. And when the economist John Maynard Keynes came, much later, to read through a great cache of Newton's private papers, the alchemical ones, the secret ones, he was so struck by what he found that he gave Newton a name that has stuck ever since. He called him the last of the magicians, not the first of the scientists, the last of the magicians. Sit with that for a moment, here in the dark. The man we hold up as the very founder of the modern, rational, mechanical view of the world was, in his own time and in his own heart, the last in a long, long line of seekers who believed there was a hidden order to things written down in old and secret texts. And one of the texts he believed in enough to translate by hand was the one we are following tonight. Now hold that image gently. Newton by candlelight copying out an ancient paragraph. We will come back to him. We will come back to him much later, near the end of the night. And that line of his will mean even more by then. For now, just let him sit there in the corner of your mind, quill in hand, and let us go and find out what on earth that paragraph was, and where it came from, and why so great a mind would bother. Because here is the thing that makes this whole story so strange and so worth telling slowly. That text Newton was copying, the emerald tablet, is tiny. It is short enough to recite in full in under a minute. The classic version, the one that came down through Latin into English, runs to only about a dozen sentences, a single paragraph. From its opening, true, without falsehood, certain and most true, down to its closing words about completing what has been said of the operation of the sun. That is all it is. A paragraph. You could write it on a postcard. You could whisper the whole of it before you fall asleep. And yet, on this single short paragraph, centuries of commentary hang. Whole libraries of interpretation. Generations of alchemists pored over its dozen sentences as though they were the most important words ever written, turning each phrase over and over, certain that some immense secret was folded up inside them. Kings sought it. Scholars argued about it. Newton translated it. And it is barely longer than the breath you are taking right now. That is one of the small wonders we will keep returning to tonight. How can so short a text have cast so long a shadow? Keep that question loose in your mind. We will not answer it all at once. We will let the answer build slowly, the way the night builds toward morning. So where did this paragraph come from? Here the legend and the history begin to part ways, and both are beautiful in their own manner. The legend, the old story, the tradition tells about itself, is this. The emerald tablet was not written on paper at all. It was found, the legend says, inscribed upon a slab of pure emerald or some deep green stone, its letters carved into the gleaming surface. And it was discovered, the story goes, clutched in the hands of a corpse. The corpse of Hermes Trismegistus himself, lying in a hidden cave or a forgotten tomb, the green tablet held against his chest, waiting through the long centuries for someone to come and read it. Now, I want to be careful here and honest with you, because honesty is its own kind of comfort. That story, the slab of emerald, the body in the cave, the secret held in dead hands, is a legend. It is part of the tradition, a tale the tradition told about its own origins. It is not documented history. There is no surviving slab of green stone in any museum. No archaeologist ever pulled an emerald tablet from an Egyptian tomb. The emerald itself is symbolic, a piece of the mystery rather than a piece of geology. So when you hear, as you may have heard before, that the emerald tablet was a real green stone found in a pyramid, you can let that go now, softly. The truth, as we will see, is stranger and in some ways more wonderful than the legend. But the legend is part of the story too, and it tells us something true about how people felt about this text. They felt it was precious enough to be carved in jewels. They felt it had come from beyond the ordinary world, passed from the hand of someone more than human. And that brings us to the man or the god at the center of it all. Hermes Trismegistus. Let me say that name slowly because it will be with us all night. Hermes Trismegistus. The word Trismegistus is Greek, and it means simply the thrice greatest. Hermes, the thrice greatest. Greatest 3 times over. It is a title of immense reverence, the kind of name you give to someone you believe stands above all other teachers who ever lived. But who was he? And here we arrive at something genuinely fascinating, the kind of fact that once you know it, makes the whole tradition glow with a new light. Hermes Trismegistus was never a single man, and he was never quite a single god either. He was a fusion, a blending of 2 figures from 2 different worlds melted together in the great cultural furnace of the ancient Mediterranean. To understand it, picture the land of Egypt long ago, after the conquests of Alexander the Great, when Greek culture and Egyptian culture had been pressed together for generations and had begun, slowly, to mingle and merge. This is the world we call Hellenistic Egypt, a place where Greek-speaking people lived among the temples and the gods of a civilization far older than their own. And in that world, 2 gods came to be seen as one. On the Greek side, there was Hermes. You may know him already, in his Roman form, as Mercury. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, the swift one with winged sandals, the god who could move between worlds. He carried messages between the gods and human beings, and importantly, he was the one who guided the souls of the dead down into the underworld. He was the god of the boundary, the crossing, the threshold. He was also a god of language, of writing, of cleverness and wisdom, and, yes, a certain trickster magic. On the Egyptian side there was Thoth. Thoth was one of the great gods of Egypt, often pictured with the head of an ibis, that long-beaked wading bird, or sometimes as a baboon. And Thoth was the god of writing itself. The Egyptians believed he had invented the very art of writing, the sacred hieroglyphs, the words of the gods. He was the divine scribe, the keeper of knowledge, the lord of wisdom and of magic, the one who recorded the judgment of souls in the afterlife. He too stood at the boundary between worlds, weighing the hearts of the dead. And so you can see how it happened. Here was Hermes, Greek god of writing, wisdom, magic, and the boundary between worlds. And here was Thoth, Egyptian god of writing, wisdom, magic, and the boundary between worlds. To the Greeks living in Egypt, looking at Thoth, the resemblance was unmistakable. This Egyptian god of the scribes and the secrets, surely they thought, this is our Hermes in Egyptian dress. And so the 2 were identified, woven into one. Hermes became Thoth, and Thoth became Hermes, and out of that weaving emerged a 3rd figure, greater than either alone. Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest, a god of wisdom and writing and magic who belonged fully to neither Greece nor Egypt, but to the strange, shared world between them. Feel for a moment how fitting that is, a god of boundaries and crossings who is himself a crossing, a blending, a figure standing on the threshold between 2 civilizations, a god of writing who would go on to have an entire library of mysterious texts attributed to his name. He is the boundary made into a person. And it is to this thrice greatest figure, this fusion of the Greek messenger and the Egyptian scribe, that the emerald tablet, and so much else, would come to be attributed. When the legend says the tablet was found in the hands of Hermes, this is the Hermes it means. Not a simple man and not a simple god, but the blended wisdom figure of a whole ancient world. There is something soothing in that, I think, if you let it settle. The idea that the deepest wisdom belongs to no single nation, that it arises in the meeting place, in the in-between, where two ways of seeing the world come together and make something new. The thrice greatest is what is born when worlds touch gently and mingle rather than clash. And we, listening here tonight, scattered across so many countries and time zones, are a little like that too. A gathering in the in-between, in the shared dark between the day that has ended and the morning that has not yet come. So already, you see, we have several threads loosening in our hands, and I want to name them softly before we pause, so they can sit quietly in your mind and pull you gently onward the way a story should. We have Newton, by candlelight, copying a paragraph that begins true, without falsehood, and we have set him aside for later, when his line will mean even more. We have the tablet itself, barely a dozen sentences long, and the lovely unanswered question of how something so small could matter so much. We have the legend of the green stone in the dead god's hands, which we have gently set down as a legend. And we have Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest, born from the fusion of Hermes and Thoth in Hellenistic Egypt, the figure to whom all of this was attributed. And there are two more threads I will only whisper now and pick up much later in the night, so that they wait for you like doors not yet opened. The first is this: there is a set of so-called ancient Hermetic principles that you may well have heard before, somewhere quoted as the timeless wisdom of Egypt. 7 of them. And the truth of where those 7 really came from is one of the gentlest surprises this whole story holds. But not yet. We will come to it when the time is right. The second thread is this: for 1,000 years, much of this wisdom was simply lost to the Western world, vanished, gone, until one day a single manuscript arrived in the city of Florence, and a great patron made a decision that changed the course of European thought. But that too is for later. Let those 2 doors stay closed for now. We will open them slowly together before the night is through. For now, let us simply rest in what we have: a short, strange, ancient paragraph, a god of 2 worlds, a great scientist who was in his own heart the last of the magicians. That is enough to be going on with. That is plenty to carry down into sleep. So let us pause here for a little while. There is no need to hold any of this tightly. Let the names loosen their grip. Hermes, Thoth, Newton, let them float if they like, the way thoughts float at the edge of sleep, half there and half gone. You do not need to remember them. They will be here when or if you return. Take a slow, deep breath now. In gently through the nose, and let it go slowly through the mouth, longer on the way out than on the way in. Feel your shoulders soften. Feel the small distance between your back teeth, your jaw unclenching, letting itself be heavy. Notice the quiet in the room around you, whatever quiet you have. The hum of something far off, perhaps. The sound of your own slow breathing. The warmth gathering under the blanket where your body rests. There is nothing you need to do, no effort to make, no thread to keep hold of. The story will wait for you patiently exactly where we left it. If you drift off now, you will have lost nothing at all, because the whole of this is only here to keep you company down into rest. And if you are still here, still gently awake, that is fine too. Just keep breathing slow and easy, and let the next part of the story come to you the way the next part of a dream comes, without your having to reach for it. When you are ready, and only when you are ready, we will continue together. We will go back, further back, into the deep layers of this tradition, and untangle, very gently, the 2 distinct texts that lie at its heart. The long philosophical writings full of visions of the divine mind and the soul's slow journey home, and the short cryptic tablet itself, whose true and surprising origin we have not yet uncovered, We will meet the disciples who learned at the feet of Hermes with their strange old names. We will hear what the famous line, "as above, so below," actually means, and why it has whispered through the centuries. There is no rush. There is so much night still ahead of us, and we will take it slowly, one gentle turn at a time. For now, just rest. Just breathe. Let the green stone glimmer somewhere far off in the dark of your mind, and let Newton set down his quill, and let the thrice greatest one stand quietly at his threshold between the worlds, waiting, as he has waited for so very long, and we will go on together when you are ready. Welcome to Be Wise and Relax. Tonight we are going to slow down together and spend some time with one of the strangest, most beautiful threads in the whole history of Western thought, a tradition called Hermeticism. If that word means nothing to you, that is perfectly fine. You do not need to know anything about Hermeticism to listen. You do not need to believe anything or follow anything or remember a single name. You only need to lie back and let the old story wash over you like slow water. If you feel like it, before your eyes grow too heavy, you might leave a small note below, just what time it is, where you are, and the name of the place you are listening from. It is a quiet way of knowing we are all here together in the dark, scattered across the world, all settling in at the same gentle hour. Then let your hands grow soft. Take one slow, deep breath and let it go. Now, let me tell you something that almost no one believes the first time they hear it. Isaac Newton, the man who explained gravity, who gave us the laws of motion, whose name we still teach to children as the very picture of cold, clear science. Isaac Newton once sat at a desk by candlelight and copied out by his own hand a single, short, ancient paragraph. And the first words he wrote were these: "'Tis true without lying, certain and most true." Sit with that for a moment in the warm dark. The most rigorous mind of his age, the architect of the modern world, bent over a piece of old, cryptic, mystical text, translating it word by word as carefully as he ever measured the fall of an apple or the path of a comet. And here is the part that is stranger still. When you add it all up, Newton wrote more words on alchemy, on these hidden traditions, than he ever wrote on the physics we remember him for. Far more. Pages and pages in his own neat hand on transmutation, on hidden correspondences, on the secret operations of nature. After he died, those papers were tucked away, almost forgotten, an embarrassment to the keepers of his legacy. And then centuries later, when they came up for sale at an auction, a man bought a great pile of them. That man was the economist John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes, after he had read through what Newton had truly spent his nights on, said something that has never quite left the air since. He said that Newton was not the first of the age of reason, he was the last of the magicians. The last of the magicians. Let those words drift through you slowly. The man who gave us the clockwork heavens was, in his own quiet hours, chasing something far older and far stranger. And the small paragraph he copied out so carefully, the one that begins, "true without lying," that paragraph is where we are going very gently tonight. Because here is the wonder of it. Everything we will speak of, the long tradition, the great names, the centuries of seekers, all of it, in a sense, hangs upon a single, short text. Barely a dozen sentences, a paragraph you could read aloud in less than a minute. And the legend says it was found inscribed upon a slab of green stone. Emerald, the old tellings say, glowing softly. Held in the hands of a man who was also called a god. Imagine that just for a moment, the way you would imagine the opening of a dream. A cave, perhaps, or a hidden tomb. Dust and silence. And there, a tablet of green stone, and resting upon it, the still hands of a figure no one is quite sure ever lived at all. A man with 3 titles, Hermes, the thrice greatest. We will come back to that green stone. We will find out, much later in the night, where the tablet truly came from, and the answer is far more surprising and far more human than the legend. But for now, let us simply let the image rest there, glimmering at the edge of sleep. First, though, you might be wondering, who was he? This man, also called a god. This Hermes, the thrice greatest. And the honest answer is one of the loveliest strange facts in all of this. He was not one figure at all. He was two, gently melted together into one. Long ago in Egypt, after the Greeks had come and settled there, two old traditions began to flow into a single channel. The Greeks had their god Hermes, the swift messenger, the one with winged sandals, the guide of souls, the god of writing and of cleverness, the one who could pass between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And the Egyptians had their own god, far older, named Thoth. Thoth, who they said had invented writing itself. Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, the recorder of the dead, the master of sacred words. Thoth, who also stood at the boundary between the worlds. And the Greeks living now in that ancient land looked at Thoth and saw their own Hermes looking back. Two gods of writing, two gods of wisdom, two gods who stood at the threshold, at the doorway between one world and the next. So they did what people have always done when two great things meet in the dark. They let them become one. Out of that meeting, in the long, warm twilight of a Greek and Egyptian world, came a new figure. Not quite Hermes, not quite Thoth. Something woven from both. And to him they gave the name that means thrice greatest, Hermes Trismegistus. The supposed author of secret books, the keeper of the deepest wisdom, the one whose name would be whispered for the next 2,000 years. There is something fitting, isn't there, in a god of the threshold being himself a kind of threshold, a door made of two doors, a name made of two names. He stands, even now, at the edge of things, between the old and the new, between the seen and the unseen, between waking and the long, slow drift towards sleep. And there is so much still ahead of us. We have not yet opened the great philosophical books that were written in his name, the ones full of visions of a divine mind and of the soul's slow journey home through the spheres of heaven. We have not yet met the disciples who sat and learned with their soft, strange names. We have not yet heard what the famous line truly means, the one that has echoed down the centuries, as above, so below. And we have not yet found out the real surprising story of where that little green tablet actually came from, or why, 1,000 years after it should have been lost forever, a single manuscript came drifting back into the world and changed everything. We will hold Newton gently in mind and the words he wrote by candlelight and return to him when the time is right. But none of that is for this moment. This moment is only for resting. So let us pause here, you and I together. Take one more slow, deep breath in through the nose, soft and unhurried, and let it ease all the way out. Notice how your body has begun to grow a little heavier against the bed. Notice the quiet in the room around you, holding you the way the dark holds the stars. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Let the green stone glimmer far off. Let the thrice greatest one stand quietly at his doorway between the worlds. And when you are ready, and only when you are ready, we will go on together, deeper into the old, gentle night. We begin then with the question of names and categories, because the tradition we are moving through is old enough and layered enough that its own parts are sometimes confused for one another, even by people who love it deeply. And it matters, gently, quietly, to hold them distinct. Not so that you must memorize anything, you do not, but so that as the story unfolds around you, you can feel the different textures of what was written and what was believed and what survived. There were in the end two great rivers that flowed together under the name of Hermes Trismegistus. Two kinds of writing, both claiming his hand, both enormous in what they carried into the centuries that followed. And they are not the same river. They began in different places, moved through different soils, and arrived in different rooms. The first river is the one scholars call the Corpus Hermeticum. That name, Corpus Hermeticum, means simply the body of Hermetic writings. A body, a gathered, living thing. It is a collection of philosophical treatises written in Greek, composed in Roman Egypt, and the scholars who have read them most carefully. People like Garth Fowden and Brian Copenhaver, who spent their working lives among these pages, place their composition somewhere in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. Not in the age of the pharaohs, not in the time of great pyramids still being cut from stone. In the time of Rome, when Egypt had already been a province of the Roman Empire for well over 100 years, when the streets of Alexandria carried both Greek and Egyptian voices, when gods and philosophies were traded and blended the way goods were traded in a port. This is important not to diminish what was written. What was written is extraordinary. But to understand where it truly came from is to understand something remarkable, that it was not a report from the dawn of the world, but an achievement of a remarkable moment of fusion. The people who composed these treatises in Greek were living inside 2 civilizations at once. They carried Egypt in their bones and Greece in their language, and Rome around them like a city. What they wrote reflected all 3, and it reflected also the spiritual searching that was alive everywhere in that era. An age of mystery cults and competing visions of the cosmos, and genuine longing for something that could be known, something that could be trusted, something divine. The Corpus Hermeticum, in the form that eventually came down to us through Byzantine copying and transmission, contains 17 treatises. The number shifts slightly depending on how you count the groupings, but 17 is the figure most scholars use. Some of them are long, some are brief. All of them are written as dialogues, as conversations. Someone speaks and someone listens and asks questions and receives the teaching. That form is itself a kind of tenderness. It places the reader in the position of the student, which means it never harangues. It teaches by sitting beside you. The teachers and students in these dialogues have names that sound, to a modern ear, both familiar and strange. One of the disciples is called Tat, a short name, almost a breath, derived perhaps from the Egyptian Thoth himself. Tat is the son and student, the one who receives the most intimate teachings. Another is called Asclepius, after the Greek god of healing. Another is called Ammon, named for the great Egyptian god Ammon, king of the gods of Thebes. And the teacher who speaks to all of them, who unfolds the mysteries, who answers question after question with a patience that feels like the patience of water moving slowly over stone. That teacher is Hermes Trismegistus himself. So the dialogues move. Hermes speaks. Tat listens. Ammon asks. Asclepius receives. And through the back and forth, a vision of the cosmos gradually assembles itself, like a mosaic laid piece by piece until the whole image becomes visible. The very first treatise in the collection, the one placed at the beginning, the one that opens the door, has its own name within the name. It is called the Poimandres. That word is a little harder to translate. It may mean something like the shepherd of men, or the mind of sovereignty, or the power of the mind. Scholars have offered different readings and none is fully certain. But what it describes is unmistakable. It describes a vision. Hermes is alone. He is sinking into a kind of silence, a heaviness of mind, a state that sounds not unlike the state you may be drifting toward right now. The loosening of the ordinary day, the beginning of something larger. And out of that state something appears to him. A vast, boundless presence, light, and then darkness, and then movement. And a voice that identifies itself as Poimandres, as the mind, the divine mind, the source and substance of all things, the mind of the all. And in the vision that follows, this divine mind shows Hermes the origin of everything. The teaching that unfolds in the Poimandres is dense and beautiful and strange, and we will not try to follow every step of it tonight. But the heart of it is this: at the foundation of everything, there is mind. The Greek word is nous, and that is exactly what it sounds like, a word that sits at the root of words like nous in English slang, meaning intelligence, and of the word paranoia, which means beside the mind, nous. The divine intellect, the primordial awareness from which everything else poured. The corpus presents God, or the all, the one, as this mind, this nous, and it presents the cosmos as the thought, or the image of this mind. Not something separate from mind, not something merely made by mind as a craftsman makes a chair, but something that emanates from mind the way light emanates from the sun. The sun does not choose to shine. It shines because it is the sun. In this vision, the cosmos exists because the divine mind thought it, and the divine mind cannot stop thinking. And into this cosmos, something else descended, something that the Poimandres calls the human soul. The soul in this Hermetic vision is not simply a ghost inside a body. It is something that passed on its way into embodied life through the 7 spheres of heaven. Think of the ancient sky as it was understood then. Not the modern astronomical sky with its billions of galaxies, but a layered sky, like a series of transparent bowls nested inside one another, each one governed by one of the 7 known wandering stars: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, 7 spheres, 7 governors. And as the soul descended through each of these spheres on its way into a body, it picked something up. From each sphere it received a quality, an influence, a shaping, and those shapings are not presented as gifts. They are presented more like weight, like the soul gathering material as it falls, the way a stone rolling down a hill gathers dust. But the promise that lives inside this same vision is that the path can be reversed. Because the Poimandres does not simply describe a descent, it describes an ascent as well. The soul that has come to know itself, the soul that has achieved what the Greek word gnosis means, which is direct knowledge, intimate knowledge, the knowledge of the mystic rather than the knowledge of the scholar. That soul can rise back. It can shed, as it passes back upward through each sphere, the quality that sphere gave it, shedding pride, shedding arrogance, shedding false desire, as layers shed from a stone being polished, until what remains is clean and light and clear, until the soul arrives finally back at the source of the divine mind from which it came. This is the soul ascent cosmology that runs through the philosophical Hermetica like a river underground. It is why these texts were treasured. They were not merely explaining the structure of the sky, they were explaining the structure of the self. They were telling the reader, you are here in this world carrying weight you did not choose, but the weight is not permanent. The path home is real. The ascent is possible. This is a vision that would have resonated in the era when it was written, an era when Neoplatonism was also exploring the emanation of the one into the many, when Gnostic traditions were also mapping the soul's fall and possible return, when mystery cults offered initiates precisely this promise, that through the right knowledge and the right practice, the soul could rise. The Corpus Hermeticum breathes the same air as all of these. It is a child of its time and place. And its time and place were Roman Egypt in those first 3 extraordinary centuries of the Common Era, when ancient traditions were meeting new ones, and the results were luminous and strange. Take a quiet breath here. Let that image settle. The soul descending through 7 spheres, gathering weight, and the path back home rising through the same spheres, shedding what was gathered. It is a picture of returning. And there is something about lying down at night that rhymes with it gently. We put down what the day gave us. We let the ordinary weight become a little less. That is all that is needed right now. Just that. Now. The Corpus Hermeticum is one river, but there is another. Because under the name of Hermes Trismegistus, there flowed also a vast body of practical writing, texts on astrology, on alchemy, on the making of talismans, on the properties of stones and herbs and stars, on the magic of correspondences applied not as philosophy but as technique. Scholars call this the technical Hermetica, as distinct from the philosophical Hermetica of the Corpus. Both circulated under the same name, both claimed the same divine authorship. But their purposes were different, their textures were different, and their histories through the centuries were different. The philosophical Hermetica asked, what is the nature of God and the soul and the cosmos? How does the soul come to know itself, and what happens when it does? The technical Hermetica asked, what is this herb good for? Which star governs which metal? How do I make a talisman that carries the influence of Jupiter? What is the right moment to plant this crop or begin this journey or seal this agreement? 2 great rivers under one name. The towering philosopher god Hermes was also the patron of the practical craft, the working knowledge, the art of moving with the hidden currents of the cosmos rather than against them. And the line between the two was not always clean. The vision of correspondence, the idea that the great world above and the small world below reflect each other, ran through both. The philosophy and the practice were, in a sense, 2 expressions of the same root. And it is here that the second river, the shorter text, appears. The one that even Newton copied out by hand, the Emerald Tablet. Now we come to it. And this is where the story takes a turn that surprises many people, and that it is worth holding gently, the way you hold something delicate in cupped hands. The Emerald Tablet is not Greek. Its earliest surviving forms are not from Greece, not from Roman Egypt, not in the language of the Corpus Hermeticum. The earliest known versions of the Emerald Tablet appear in Arabic. The scholarly anchor for this, the foundational study, a work published in 1926 by a German scholar named Julius Ruska with the title Tabula Smaragdina, places the earliest surviving Emerald Tablet within Arabic sources dating to perhaps the 8th or 9th century of the Common Era, which means it is separated from the composition of the Corpus Hermeticum by something in the range of 500 years, and it is separated from the age of the pharaohs by more than a millennium. The text appears embedded in a larger Arabic work called the Kitab Sirr al-Khaliqa. That is a beautiful phrase. The Kitab Sirr al-Khaliqa, the book of the secret of creation, a title that holds, in those few words, everything that made this tradition irresistible to so many minds across so many centuries. The secret of creation. The hidden logic behind the visible world. The answer to the oldest question, hidden in a book, wrapped inside a tradition, spoken by a figure who was also a god. The book of the secret of creation is attributed in the manuscript tradition to a figure called Balinus, and Balinus is the Arabic name for Apollonius of Tyana, a Greek philosopher who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, a figure himself surrounded by legend, credited with miracles and wisdom, sometimes called a divine man in his own right. The real Apollonius of Tyana almost certainly did not write the Kitab Sirr, al-Khaliqa, but his name gave it authority. This was not unusual. In a world where the weight of a text depended enormously on who had written it, attributing a work to a venerable figure was a way of carrying the work forward, of lending it the gravity it needed to be taken seriously. Moses wrote things Moses did not write. Plato's school produced dialogues Plato did not write. Hermes Trismegistus had his name on everything. The question of whether the Arabic emerald tablet rests on an older Greek source that simply has not survived, that question has been raised. Some scholars have suggested the possibility of earlier roots, but the position that commands the most support, the one that Ruska and the scholars who followed him have anchored carefully, is that the Arabic transmission is what we have, and what we have is from the 8th or 9th century at the earliest. Anything earlier is, for now, speculation rather than evidence, which does not make the emerald tablet less extraordinary, it only makes it honest. And around the text there accreted, over centuries, a remarkable set of legends, stories about how it was found, because of course there were stories. A text this short, this cryptic, this loaded with implication. People needed to explain where it came from. Where could such a thing have originated? Not in the ordinary world, surely. And so the stories said it was found in a cave. It was found on a slab of the green stone that gives it its name. And in the hands of the dead figure reclining in that cave, or sitting or lying, depending on which telling you follow, was the slab, and the text was inscribed upon it. In some tellings it is Alexander the Great who discovers it, entering a hidden place after a great conquest. In others it is Sarah, said to be the wife of Abraham, the ancient patriarch, who finds the tablet in a tomb. The legends shift their finder the way legends do, attaching the discovery to whoever, in a given time and place, carries the most weight of significance. But in all the versions, the figure in the cave, the figure whose hands hold the green stone, is Hermes himself, the God-man, the thrice greatest, whose body has rested there in the dark, the text in his hands, waiting for someone with eyes to find it. There is no slab, there is no cave, not as documented history. There is no emerald or green stone whose existence has been verified. The word emerald in the tablet's name, tabula smaragdina in Latin, law al-Zumarud in Arabic, is part of the legend, not the archaeology. The legend is itself part of the tradition. It is the tradition's way of saying this knowledge did not come from an ordinary human. It came from somewhere else, from someone who stood at the boundary between the human and the divine, the way Hermes always stood at the boundary between the worlds. And yet, the words of the Emerald Tablet are real and brief. The text is barely a paragraph, a dozen sentences, short enough that even now, heard slowly in the dark, it passes through you in moments. And yet centuries of commentary hang on those few sentences, the way that sometimes a single spoken thing heard at exactly the right moment in your life can become the axis around which years of thinking quietly turn. The opening of the tablet, in the Latin tradition that passed it into the West, declares itself with a kind of strange solemnity. True, without falsehood, certain and most true. That is how it begins, not by explaining itself, not by introducing itself, but by insisting on its own truthfulness before it has said anything that could be true or false. A text that announces its own certainty before it speaks, the gesture of something that knows it will be doubted, and then it speaks. The line that has echoed down the centuries, the line that became the beating heart of the correspondence tradition, arrives in the Latin as quod est superius est sicut, quod est inferius, et quod est inferius est sicut quod est superius. What is above is like what is below, and what is below is like what is above. As above, so below. As below, so above. That is the teaching. 6 words in English, though more in Latin, carrying a whole vision of the cosmos inside them. What does it mean? It means that the cosmos is not divided into 2 utterly separate realms, the divine, unreachable and remote above, and the material, fallen and alien below. It means that the 2 reflect each other, that the great world, the macrocosm, the whole vast structure of the heavens, the planetary spheres, the movements of stars, is mirrored by the small world, by you, by the human body, by the human soul, the macrocosm, the large ordering, the cosmos itself, and the microcosm, the small ordering, the human being, micro and macro, from the Greek for small and large. 2 words that are still with us in the language, in biology and economics and architecture and everyday speech, carrying without announcement the echo of this ancient teaching. The doctrine of correspondence that lives in those 6 words is not simply a pretty metaphor. In the world where this text circulated, it was understood as a literal description of how reality was structured. The planets did not merely resemble certain qualities, they governed them. The sun did not simply look warm, it was the principle of warmth and vitality in everything that lived under it, including the human body, including the metals in the earth. To know the sun was to know something about gold, about the heart, about kingship, about the principle of centrality and radiance wherever it appeared. And that was not poetic license, that was cosmology, that was the map. And this principle was the key that unlocked the whole technical practice of the Hermetic tradition. The astrology, the alchemy, the medicine, the magic. If as above, so below, then the movements of the planets tell you something about events on Earth. If as above, so below, then the properties of a star can be captured in a talisman. The influence of a planet can be drawn down through the right stone or herb or image at the right moment. If as above, so below, then to understand the cosmos is to understand the self, and to work on the self is to resonate with something vast. The tablet continues after that central line. It speaks of the sun and the moon as father and mother. It speaks of the wind carrying something in its belly. It speaks of separating the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, with great ingenuity and care. These lines would later be read by alchemists as an encoded recipe. But we will come to that. We will come to the sun as father and the moon as mother and what generations of people believed was hidden in those words. That is another chapter of tonight, and it will come. For now, the close of the tablet. Because the tablet closes with a statement of identity and authority that explains the name. In the Latin tradition, the final lines of the Emerald Tablet say, and here is the origin of the epithet that Hermes holds what is called the 3 parts of the philosophy of the whole world. Tres partes philosophiae totius mundi. 3 parts of the philosophy of the whole world. And the one who holds these 3 parts is called, therefore, thrice greatest. What were those 3 parts? Medieval and Renaissance commentators gave various answers. Some said philosophy, alchemy, and astrology. Some said the knowledge of God, the knowledge of nature, and the knowledge of the human. Some said priesthood, kingship, and the wisdom of the mage. The number 3 was understood as the fullness of mastery. 3 being the number of completion in so many ancient traditions, 3 being the triangle, the first closed shape, the minimum to make a whole. And the epithet that had been forming for centuries in the merger of Thoth and Hermes, the greatest, the most powerful, the wisest, found in these closing lines of the tablet a kind of explanation for itself. Thrice greatest because he mastered 3. because he held the three parts, because he stood at the junction of three great rivers of knowledge. Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest Hermes, the teacher who speaks in the corpus, the figure whose hands hold the tablet in the cave, the deity at the threshold between the seen and the unseen. All of this converges in that name, that epithet, those three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. And the tablet's closing declaration in the tradition that carried it through the medieval centuries is this: "Hence I am called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. Complete is what I have said of the operation of the sun." The operation of the sun. That phrase alone could keep a mind busy for a century. But for now, simply notice it. Notice the way the text closes by naming itself, the way it insists on its authority, the way the figure speaking through it signs his name in the last breath, as if to say, "I was here, I held this, I gave it to you," a dozen sentences, the beginning and the end of a single green slab said to be found in a cave. And out of those few sentences, everything that came after. Let us pause here now, you and I. Let us take this moment slowly. Take a quiet breath in. Let it move through you gently, the way a breath does when the body is already beginning to ease into rest. Feel the weight of wherever you are lying, the familiar press of the mattress, the warmth of the blanket, the slight cooling of the air against your face. You have just heard something that was believed for centuries to be among the oldest truths in the world. Two rivers under one name, the great philosophical dialogues of the Corpus Hermeticum, written in Greek in Roman Egypt in the first centuries of the Common Era, and the brief, strange, encoded lines of the Emerald Tablet, earliest known in Arabic 8 or 9 centuries later, before it moved into Latin and from Latin into every mind that came looking for the secret of creation. You have heard the vision of the divine mind, the nous, the source from which the cosmos pours like light from a sun, and the soul's long descent through 7 spheres and the promise of its possible ascent. You have heard the 3 disciples, Tat and Asclepius and Ammon, sitting and listening and asking the questions that matter. You have heard where the tablet truly came from, and the beautiful old legends that gathered around it, and the words quod est superius est sicut, quod est inferius, that became the axis of a tradition. You do not need to hold any of this. You do not need to carry it anywhere. It is simply here, in the air around you, like the warmth of the dark. And there is more still ahead. The journey of these ideas through the centuries, the hands that held them, the rooms they entered, the things they changed, and the gentle surprise that is still waiting at the end of that journey. But none of that is for this breath. This breath is only for rest. Take a slow, deep breath in through the nose and let it go. Let the 7 spheres hang in their places. Let the green stone rest in its cave. Let the name, thrice greatest Trismegistus, settle into the quiet like something you have known for a very long time. When you are ready, and only when you are ready, we will continue together into the next part of this old, gentle story. And so we continue. The Emerald Tablet, as we have seen, arrived in the Arabic world bearing the name of Balinus, and in that Arabic form it already carried enormous weight, a text said to contain the secret of creation pressed into a handful of sentences, brief as a prayer and dense as a stone. But what the early readers of those Arabic lines saw when they looked at the tablet was not primarily a spiritual document. They saw something far more practical. They saw instructions. Let us stay with that for a moment, because it is easy to hear words like the great work and the philosopher's stone and imagine something theatrical, something belonging to a stage or a costume. but the men and women who bent over furnaces and crucibles and alembics, the glass vessels shaped like teardrops, in the medieval period were not performing theatre. They were working. They were labouring. They were reading the tablet the way a craftsman reads a blueprint, and what they believed those compressed lines described was one of the most audacious projects a human being could undertake, the transformation of base matter into something incorruptible and perfect. The great work, that is what they called it, the opus magnum, and at its centre the goal that gave the work its name in the popular imagination, the philosopher's stone. Not a stone exactly, or not necessarily. Sometimes imagined as a powder, sometimes as a substance that could be held in the palm, sometimes as a red or white tincture that, when added to molten base metal, would transmute it into gold or silver. The goal was not only material, though. For the more philosophically minded alchemists, the transmutation of lead into gold was also a metaphor, or rather, it was both at once. The purification of base matter mirrored the purification of the soul. The outer work and the inner work were the same work, as above, so below. And the emerald tablet, they believed, encoded all of it. Listen to the lines they poured over. The sun is its father, the moon is its mother, the wind has carried it in its belly, the earth is its nurse. A medieval alchemist reading those words heard something specific. The sun and moon referred not just to the sky, but to sulfur and mercury. Two principles they believed underlay all material transformation, a masculine active principle and a feminine receptive one, the fixed and the volatile, the dry fire and the wet dissolution. Separate the subtle from the gross, the tablet says. That is, purify. Remove the impure from the pure. Rise from the gross and dense to the fine and rarefied, and then, crucially, bring the refined substance back down, returned to earth but transformed, made perfect by its journey upward and back, the operation of the sun. That phrase in the tablet's closing lines was not decorative. It was understood as a technical term pointing at the alchemical process by which a substance is heated, dissolved, sublimed, made to rise as vapor, and then allowed to descend again as something new, like rain, like the cycling of water from ocean to cloud to river and back, except the goal was not to end where you began, but to end somewhere finer. A scholar named Hortulanus wrote a commentary on the Emerald Tablet in the medieval period, one of the oldest surviving commentaries we have, and he worked through the tablet's sentences one by one, translating each compressed line into alchemical procedure. For Hortulanus, when the tablet says, "Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross," gently and with great ingenuity, it is describing exactly what a practicing alchemist must do at the crucible, patiently, carefully, with attention and skill, not with brute force. The word gently appears in that line. It struck readers then and it strikes us now, gently. The tablet is asking not for violence upon matter, but for something closer to listening to it. There is something in that if you let yourself feel it in the dark. The idea that the secret of transformation is not force, but careful, patient attention. Gentle separation. Bringing things to the right conditions and waiting. Take a breath. The tablet moved into the Latin West by a route that is worth knowing because it did not arrive alone, and the company it kept tells us a great deal about the medieval world's relationship with knowledge. It traveled partly through a text called the Secretum Secretorum, the secret of secrets. And that name alone could keep a mind awake with curiosity, so let us be unhurried about it. The Secretum Secretorum was one of the most widely copied and read texts of the entire medieval period in Europe. It circulated in dozens of manuscripts. It was translated into almost every European vernacular, and it was believed, with great conviction, to be a letter from Aristotle to Alexander the Great, the young conqueror he had tutored, containing the private, practical wisdom that Aristotle had thought too powerful or too sacred to put in his public works. Statecraft, medicine, physiognomy, the reading of character from the face, astrology, and, buried within it in some of its versions, the Emerald Tablet. Now pause on that. The Secretum Secretorum was not in fact a letter from Aristotle. Scholars have long known it to be a pseudepigraphical text, that is, a text that borrows a famous name for authority, compiled from earlier Arabic sources translated into Latin from Arabic in the 12th century. But for medieval readers, that chain of authority, Aristotle, Alexander, the ancient Greeks, and within all of that, the even more ancient Hermes, was exactly the kind of weight that made a text worth copying, worth memorizing, worth believing. The tablet arrived in Latin minds already wearing borrowed grandeur, tucked inside a letter from a philosopher to a king. From at least the 12th century then, Latin reading scholars had access to the Emerald Tablet, and through the following centuries it passed from hand to hand, commentary to commentary, translation to translation, gathering readers the way certain very old stones gather moss, slowly, persistently, in the damp and the dark. But the Corpus Hermeticum, the longer, deeper body of philosophical Greek treatises, was a different matter. Those texts had been known in the Latin West only through a shadow, through a fragment here and a reference there. Through Lactantius, who was a Christian author of the early 4th century and who quoted the Hermetica approvingly, treating Hermes Trismegistus as a pagan prophet who had somehow seen the truth of the one God. Through Augustine, who mentioned the Hermetica and was more skeptical, and above all, through a single text that had not been lost, the one major Hermetic treatise that survived the long centuries intact in Latin, the Asclepius. The Asclepius is different from the short, crystalline sharpness of the Emerald Tablet. It is longer, more conversational, more meandering in the way a very late-night conversation meanders when the formal questions have been asked, and what is left is the deeper, stranger talk. It takes the form of a dialogue, and its speaker, Hermes Trismegistus, addresses his disciple Asclepius, who gives the work its name. And the Asclepius says something that medieval readers could not stop thinking about, something that fascinated them and also disturbed them in equal measure. It says that the ancient Egyptians had learned how to make the gods, not to worship them, not to invoke them, to make them, to animate statues with divine presence by means of sacred arts, herbs, stones, particular arrangements of matter held in particular forms so that a god would descend and dwell inside a carved image. The text describes this with something very close to pride as evidence of human wisdom and power, just as the Lord and Father, or whatever name one gives to that supreme being, created the gods of heaven, Hermes says in the Asclepius, so too the Egyptians, using their wisdom, created terrestrial gods from earthly materials. Gods that heal, gods that prophesy, gods that can love and grow angry. You can hear how this would be unsettling, and how it would also be thrilling. The idea that matter, rightly worked, rightly understood, rightly ordered, might become a vessel for something divine. The idea that the boundary between the sacred and the material was not a wall but a membrane. This was the God-making passage, and it burned in the minds of Renaissance thinkers for decades after they rediscovered it. But before we reach the Renaissance, let us stay a moment with the Asclepius's great claim about the human being, because there is something in it that does not startle. It simply settles like a hand placed gently on the shoulder. In the Asclepius, in the Latin version that survived through the Middle Ages, once attributed to the writer Apuleius, Hermes Trismegistus makes a declaration. He calls the human being a magnum miraculum, a great miracle, not because of our power or our cleverness, but because of our position. We stand, the text suggests, exactly between the divine and the material. We are not gods, but we can know the gods. We are not earth alone, but we are made of earth. We contain within us both the high and the low, and that is not a curse. It is, the Asclepius says, the definition of our dignity. Magnum miraculum est homo. A human being is a great miracle. Sit with that, if you like, here in the dark. Not as a doctrine, simply as a way of thinking about where you are, right now, at the edge of sleep. Part material, breathing in and out. Part something that can wonder, can remember, can follow the quiet thread of an old story through the centuries. A great miracle. You do not need to believe it in any strong sense, but you are allowed to let it rest beside you. The Asclepius survived. The Corpus Hermeticum did not in the Latin West, not during those long centuries between the fall of Rome and the Italian Renaissance. It was preserved in Byzantium, in the Greek-speaking East, in monasteries and scriptoria, where ancient manuscripts were copied by patient hands in the same slow way that snow accumulates, flake by flake, until something of great weight has gathered without anyone quite noticing. And then, around the year 1460, a manuscript arrived in Florence. Let us slow down here, because this is one of those moments in the history of ideas that actually happened, that is documented in real letters and real records, and that had consequences almost impossible to overstate. A Byzantine monk, some sources say his name was Leonardo of Pistoia, brought a Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum to Florence. This was not an accident. It was a period of extraordinary cultural ferment and panic and desire. The Byzantine Empire was collapsing under the pressure of Ottoman expansion. Constantinople had fallen in 1453, just a few years earlier, and Greek-speaking scholars and manuscripts were flowing westward like water from a cracking vessel, and Italian humanists were catching everything they could. Florence, at this moment, was shaped by one man above almost all others, Cosimo de' Medici, banker, patriarch, the man behind the Platonic Academy. Old and dying by 1460, but still directing the intellectual life of his city with remarkable precision. Cosimo had spent decades trying to gather the best minds and the best texts of the ancient world around him, and he had commissioned the scholar Marsilio Ficino to begin the enormous labor of translating the complete works of Plato into Latin, a project of staggering ambition, because while individual Platonic dialogues had been known in Latin, the full Platonic corpus was effectively inaccessible to readers who could not read Greek. Ficino had begun that work. He was in the middle of it, and then the Hermetic manuscript arrived. Cosimo looked at it, and he made a decision that tells us everything about what the Renaissance believed it was holding. He told Ficino to stop translating Plato. Put Plato aside, translate the Hermetica first. Think about that instruction. Plato, whose work had been sought and gathered at enormous expense, whose philosophy was considered the summit of pagan wisdom, was placed second. Plato would wait. Because these texts, these dialogues between Hermes Trismegistus and his disciples, were believed to be older, far older, not just older than Plato, but older than almost everything. Cosimo and the scholars around him believed they were holding the recovered wisdom of an ancient Egyptian sage who had lived in the time of Moses, who had perhaps written before Moses, who had received divine truth directly in some era before the long forgetting. The belief that there had been a chain of ancient wisdom keepers, a lineage of what they called the Prisci Theologi, the ancient theologians, was fundamental to Renaissance intellectual culture in a way that is hard to fully convey across the distance of centuries. The idea was that divine truth had been given to humanity not once but several times in several traditions, and that the very oldest transmissions, Zoroaster, Hermes Trismegistus, Orpheus, Pythagoras, Plato, were not contradictions of each other but variations on the same original light seen through different prisms. And Hermes was, they believed, the first, or nearly the first, older than Plato by an almost unimaginable span. So when Cosimo said, "Translate the Hermetica first," he was not being eccentric. He was following the logic of his age with perfect consistency. He was saying, "Give me the oldest thing we have." Marsilio Ficino finished his Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1463. Cosimo died that same year, having, it is said, lived long enough to read it. The translation was printed in 1471 in the early decades of European printing, and it spread across the educated world with the new and astonishing speed that the printing press made possible. Within a generation, readers throughout Europe could hold Hermes Trismegistus in their hands in Latin. The dialogues of Hermes and Tat, of Hermes and Asclepius, of Hermes and Ammon, dialogues about the nature of the divine mind, about the soul's journey, about the relationship between the cosmos and the human being, were suddenly available, suddenly being quoted, suddenly being woven into sermons and paintings and philosophical arguments. The Prisci Theologi, Hermes as a contemporary of Moses. That belief was not just an academic position, it was written into stone, quite literally. In the Cathedral of Siena, in the decade of the 1480s, a floor mosaic was laid that depicted Hermes Trismegistus as a venerable robed sage, larger than life, at the center of an elaborate design, with an inscription beneath him that read, in Latin, Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, Contemporaneus Moysi. Hermes Mercurius, the thrice greatest, contemporary of Moses. That floor is still there, in Siena. You can walk on it, or rather you would walk around it because it is roped off now, too precious to be walked on, but you can stand at its edge and look down at the face of the man the Renaissance believed had received the wisdom of the ages at roughly the same moment Moses received the tablets of the law. The cathedral did not hide this image. It placed it at the entrance, one of the first things you would see upon entering, as if to say, this is one of the foundations. Here is where some of the oldest truth came from. Welcome. There is something quietly astonishing about that floor, even now. Even knowing what we know, which is that Hermes Trismegistus was not a historical person who walked alongside Moses, but a layered, mythological and literary figure, and that the texts attributed to him were composed more than 1,000 years after Moses. Even knowing all of that, there is something moving about the confidence, the certainty, the desire to honor this tradition by setting it in stone at the entrance to a sacred space. The people who laid that floor believed they were doing something holy. And the longing behind that act, the longing for ancient wisdom, for a thread connecting the present to the original truth of things, is itself a very human thing and not a contemptible one. But the floor also shows us something important about how historical authority works and about the difference between what a tradition claims for itself and what the evidence supports. The Siena mosaic is proof of how powerfully the Renaissance believed in Hermes as a historical contemporary of Moses. It is not proof that he was one. Those two things are different. Holding them apart is not cynicism, it is clarity. And clarity, the ability to see a tradition whole, to honor what is genuinely ancient in it and gently note what is not, is perhaps its own kind of wisdom. Take a slow, deep breath here. Let it go. Feel the floor of this room beneath you, or the bed, the surface that is holding you right now without effort. Let the image of that Siena floor be with you for a moment. The great sage in marble, his inscription, the cathedral light falling across his face. The confidence of those craftsmen who set the stone. The long centuries they were reaching back toward. And when you are ready, we will continue. There is still more to hold, the chain of hands that carried this tradition forward into the wider world, and the quiet surprise at the end of it that we have not yet arrived at. Let all of that wait. There is no hurry. There is only this breath, and then the next one, and the old story continuing in the air, around you, as it has continued for centuries, moving from mind to mind in the dark. We will continue together. The hands that carried the tradition forward from Florence were many, and they reached in every direction at once. Marsilio Ficino completed his Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1463. That was 2 years after the Greek manuscript arrived in the city, 2 years after Cosimo de' Medici looked at the slim package of documents and decided, with the particular decisiveness of a man accustomed to moving the world, that whatever was in those pages mattered more than Plato. Plato could wait. Plato had waited this long. But these texts, these dialogues of Hermes Trismegistus with his disciples, these felt older and therefore more sacred, and Cosimo was not a young man, and he wanted to read them before he died. He did. Ficino finished in time, and 8 years later, in 1471, the translation was printed, one of the early products of the newly arrived printing press. And so the Hermetic current, which had spent centuries moving through manuscripts copied slowly by careful hands, was suddenly multiplied, distributed, sent outward into the libraries of Europe at a speed the tradition had never known before. Consider what that moment felt like from the inside. If you believed, as virtually everyone in that room believed, that these texts had been composed by a real sage named Hermes Trismegistus, who had lived in the time of Moses, who had perhaps spoken with Moses, who had arrived at the same divine truth by a different and older path, then reading them was not simply scholarship. It was contact with a source. It was a hand reaching through 3,000 years to rest on your shoulder and say, "Here is what I found at the beginning of things, before the confusions of history thickened around the truth." That is what the Renaissance received when Ficino's translations arrived. The belief in Hermes as one of the Prisci Theologi, the ancient theologians, the scattered holy men of the pre-Christian world, who had somehow, each by his own path, caught the scent of divine truth before Christ formalized it, gave these texts an authority that sat alongside Scripture rather than beneath it. The Church did not in these decades feel that authority as a threat. It felt it as confirmation. Here was yet more evidence from yet another ancient tradition that the mind behind creation had always been reaching toward the world it had made, and the world had sometimes, in its best moments, reached back. Within a generation, a young man in Mirandola read Ficino's translation and was set alight. His name was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and he was 23 years old in 1486 when he wrote what would later be called the Oration on the Dignity of Man. He intended it as a preface to 900 theses he planned to defend publicly in Rome, a kind of philosophical tournament he was proposing to hold, in which he would argue all 900 positions against all comers simultaneously. It was the intellectual equivalent of standing in a piazza and shouting, "Come everyone, let us find out what is true." The Church found this alarming. The public debate was never held, but the oration survived, and its opening is extraordinary because of who Pico chose to cite first. Not Moses, not Scripture, not Plato, Hermes Trismegistus. Pico opened by quoting, or rather paraphrasing, what he identified as a hermetic, saying that the human being is a great wonder, a great miracle. The Latin phrase from the Asclepius had been working on him, as it worked on everyone who read it. Magnum miraculum est homo, the human is a great miracle. And Pico built from there, spiraling upward into an argument that the human being is unique among created things precisely because we are not fixed. Every other creature has its assigned nature, its determined place, but the human being has been given the freedom to choose what kind of creature to become, to ascend toward the angels or descend toward the beasts, to be, in some sense, the one living thing whose nature is to have no fixed nature. It is a remarkable idea, and it began that morning in 1486 with Hermes. The Asclepius, remember, was the one major Hermetic text that had never been lost to the Latin West. Unlike the Greek Corpus Hermeticum, which had traveled through Byzantium and vanished from European awareness for centuries before the manuscript arrived in Florence, the Asclepius had survived in a Latin version, long attributed to Apuleius, the Roman novelist, though that attribution is now disputed, and so it had been available, read, and copied throughout the medieval period. Medieval thinkers knew it. They found it unusual. The passage that fascinated them most, and that also troubled them most, was the one in which Hermes describes the Egyptian priests animating statues, drawing divine powers down into stone and metal, making the statues, in some sense, alive. This was the God-making passage, and it occupied a strange position in the medieval imagination because it described practices that sounded like idolatry and magic, and yet the text in which they appeared was surrounded by language of reverence and philosophical dignity that made simple condemnation feel inadequate. Augustine had wrestled with it. Others had too. What were you supposed to do with a text that spoke in one breath of the highest divine realities, and in the next of making gods by coaxing spirits into statues? The Renaissance answer was, broadly speaking, read it allegorically, read it as philosophy, read it as part of the great ancient inheritance of wisdom that points, obliquely, imperfectly, but genuinely, toward the truth. Ficino himself practiced what he called natural magic, which he sharply distinguished from demonic magic, the careful alignment of earthly things, plants, stones, metals, music, times of day, with the celestial influences they resonated with, drawing beneficial powers downward through the chain of correspondence that linked the heavens to the earth. As above, so below. The doctrine was not merely decorative, it was operational. It told you that the universe was structured like a mirror, that everything on earth had its counterpart in the heavens and its counterpart below, that a sufficiently learned and attentive person could work with these resonances rather than against them. That is what as above, so below meant in practice in Florence in the 1460s and 1470s. Not a vague metaphor about things being connected, a working hypothesis about the architecture of reality, one that licensed the entire tradition of astrological medicine, of alchemical transmutation, of the doctrine of signatures. The belief, held through Paracelsus and beyond, that a plant's shape and color and texture signal its medicinal use because the same correspondence that links Mars to iron links a red-stemmed herb to the blood it is meant to treat. The emerald tablet sat at the center of all this as a kind of crystallized summary. Alchemists who read it did not read it as metaphor. They read it as a recipe written in the language of nature itself, which was a language of symbols and correspondences rather than of direct instruction, but a recipe nonetheless. One that could, with sufficient learning and spiritual preparation, be decoded and enacted. The sun was the father of the one thing, the moon was its mother, the wind had carried it in its belly, the earth was its nurse. By separating the subtle from the gross, by proceeding gently and with great sagacity, you could complete the great work. The great work. The phrase echoes through centuries of alchemical writing, always with this same quality of immense seriousness, as if the person using it is describing not a laboratory procedure, but a vocation, a calling. Something that required not only knowledge, but a particular orientation of the whole self toward the work. Hortulanus, a medieval commentator whose full identity remains uncertain, wrote one of the earliest and most influential Latin commentaries on the Emerald Tablet, explaining verse by verse what he believed the alchemical operation entailed. His reading set a template for generations of readers who followed. The sun and moon as principles of the masculine and feminine, the subtle and the gross as spirit and matter that must be separated and then reunited in a higher synthesis. The philosopher's stone as the achieved result of the work, a substance or a state, or perhaps both at once, that represented the perfection of matter and the illumination of the mind that had accomplished it. This double nature of the philosopher's stone, simultaneously a chemical substance that could transmute base metal into gold and a spiritual achievement that transformed the practitioner who accomplished it, is essential to understanding why the Emerald Tablet held the authority it did. It was not simply a how-to guide for making gold, though some people certainly hoped it was that. It was a description of a process by which the human being, working in matter, could participate in the fundamental operations of creation: separation, purification, reunion. The same process by which the cosmos itself had unfolded from the one thing enacted in miniature in the alchemist's vessel. Macrocosm and microcosm again, as above, so below. The laboratory as a mirror of the heavens. You can see why a text that said all of this in 12 sentences felt inexhaustible. Why commentary piled on commentary, century after century, each reader finding new layers in the dense, symbolic language, each generation bringing its own questions and receiving, or believing it received, answers. And you can see why, when the Emerald Tablet entered the Latin West through the Secretum Secretorum, the secret of secrets, that extraordinary pseudo-Aristotelian compilation that purported to be Aristotle's private letter of instruction to Alexander the Great, and which was one of the most widely copied texts of the medieval period. It arrived with enormous prestige already attached to it. The text claimed Aristotelian authority. The tablet appeared within it, and so readers encountered it already primed to take it seriously, already half believing that here was something preserved from the great age of ancient wisdom, something that the ordinary world had somehow lost access to and that was being returned to them now in this manuscript, with all the weight of antiquity behind it. The Secretum Secretorum reached the Latin West from Arabic originals in the 12th century, part of that great wave of translation activity centered in Toledo and Sicily, where Arabic texts, including the accumulated learning of Greek science and philosophy that had been preserved and extended in the Islamic world, passed back into the European tradition through the painstaking labor of scholars who knew both languages and were willing to spend their lives at the work. It was this translation movement that carried so much of what the West had lost back to it, and among the things it carried was the Emerald Tablet, from Arabic into Latin. From the 12th century forward, copied, quoted, commented upon, argued over, taken into the hands of men who believed they were handling something of incalculable age. Take a slow breath, let your body settle. The image worth holding for a moment is simply this: a text moving through hands. Arabic hands in the 9th century copying it into a philosophical compilation about the secrets of creation. Latin hands in the 12th century rendering it into the language of European scholarship. The hands of Hortulanus writing his commentary in the medieval centuries, explaining what he believed each line meant. The hands of printers in the 15th century setting the type, multiplying the text, sending it into the world at new speed. And then, though we have not yet quite arrived there, other hands, famous hands, hands whose other work you know. That thread is still ahead of us. There is no hurry. Rest here for a moment if you need to. Notice the quiet of wherever you are. The darkness or the near darkness. The weight of the blanket, if there is one, or the simple sensation of the surface beneath you, holding you the way the earth holds everything, steadily, without effort, without requiring anything in return. The tradition we are moving through tonight is very old, and it has survived many kinds of darkness and many kinds of forgetting. There is something quietly steadying in that, not because it proves the tradition true. We are being careful, as we have been careful all evening, to hold the distinction between what is historically documented and what is asserted, but because the persistence itself is a kind of human fact, and human facts are worth noticing. People, generation after generation, found something in these texts worth preserving, worth copying, worth arguing about in the margins, worth losing sleep over. In a small way tonight, you are part of that continuation. When you are ready, we will go on. There were other hands yet to come, and one pair of them belonged to a young man in Florence who would change everything, not by discovering a new fact, but by fusing two rivers of thought that had never quite touched before. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola was 23 years old in 1486 when he proposed to defend 900 theses in a public debate in Rome. 900. He wanted to synthesize in a single event every tradition of wisdom he could find: Greek philosophy, Christian theology, Islamic thought, and something newer to European scholars, something that had only recently arrived with the manuscript Ficino had translated: Hermetic wisdom. And to that already unusual mixture, Pico added one thing more: Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah. That fusion, Hermes Trismegistus, meeting the Hebrew mystical tradition, meeting Platonic philosophy, all braided together in a young Florentine's extraordinary ambition, would become one of the defining currents of the Western esoteric stream for centuries afterward. For the debate he wrote an introduction. Just an introduction, though it became the text everyone remembered. He called it the Oratio de Hominis Dignitate. We translate it today as the Oration on the Dignity of Man. It is sometimes called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, that strong acclaim, and it opens, in its first flourish of praise, by invoking Hermes Trismegistus. Pico quotes the Hermetic figure describing the human being as a magnum miraculum, a great miracle. Wonderful, remarkable, praiseworthy. The phrase comes from the Latin Asclepius, one of the few Hermetic texts that had never been lost to the West, and Pico places it at the very opening of a text that would define his era. The Church was not entirely pleased by the 900 theses. Several were condemned. The debate never happened. Pico spent time in flight, in exile, in negotiation. But the oration survived. The image survived. Hermes Trismegistus, summoned at the start of a declaration about the extraordinary nature of human beings, their freedom, their capacity to become whatever they chose to become. It was a powerful placement. The Hermetic current had arrived at the center of Renaissance thought, not in the margins, not in a library curiosity, but in the opening lines of a celebrated humanist's most famous work. Take a slow breath here. This is the thing about traditions that travel far and change many hands. They do not stay still. The emerald tablet that began, it as far as we can trace it, in an Arabic compilation about the secrets of creation, was now, in the 1480s, being woven into a declaration about human dignity. The correspondence idea that what is above is like what is below was not merely a cosmological claim anymore, it was becoming a statement about the human being as a mirror of the cosmos. A small universe, a place where the principles of the large world were recapitulated and, in Pico's hands, honored. Sleep gently with that thought if you are drifting. It asks nothing of you. A few years after Pico wrote the oration, the stonemasons of Siena were laying a floor. The Cathedral of Siena, a magnificent striped soaring structure, received in the 1480s a floor inlaid with marble panels, and among those panels Hermes Trismegistus had already taken his place, as we noted earlier tonight, labelled Contemporaneus Moysi, a contemporary of Moses. The label was not skeptical, it was not ironic, it was honorific. The cathedral floor placed this figure at the origin of wisdom, before Plato, before the philosophers, contemporary with the giver of the law. He is shown robed, bearded, venerable. He holds an open book. Two figures, one in Eastern dress and one in Western, receive wisdom from him. The image says, this man stood at the source. This man had it first. It was a beautiful belief. And it was, as we will come to in a moment, mistaken. But its beauty was real and its consequences were enormous. We should not rush past the consequences on our way to the correction. Let us sit with what that belief made possible first. If Hermes Trismegistus was as old as Moses, older than Plato, older than Aristotle, closer to the original divine dispensation, then his texts carried a weight that no merely ancient philosopher could claim. Reading the Hermetica was not like reading Plato. It was like reading a report from closer to the source. The Prisi Theologi, the ancient theologians, the ones Ficino and his circle believed had received something directly from God or from the structure of reality itself. Hermes stood first among them. This is why Cosimo de' Medici told Ficino to stop translating Plato. This is why a Greek manuscript arriving in Florence around 1460 caused that instruction to be issued. Plato was important, but Hermes was thought to be older and holier. In the hierarchy of ancient wisdom as the Renaissance understood it, this text came first. The consequences radiated outward for more than a century, and some of them led into fire. Giordano Bruno was born in 1548 near Naples. By the time he was a young man, the Hermetic texts were part of the intellectual air of his world. He absorbed them, he loved them, he built on them a vision of the universe that was, for his time, startling, infinite. The universe, Bruno argued, was not the small enclosed sphere of traditional cosmology, the Earth at the center, surrounded by crystalline spheres, with God beyond the outermost one. No, the universe was infinite, without a fixed center, filled with an infinity of worlds. Suns without number, other inhabited places perhaps beyond our sight. He was not the only one arguing for a sun-centered model in those decades. Copernicus had proposed it. But Bruno's reasons and his framing were different in a particular way. Alongside mathematical and astronomical argument, his vision was shot through with Hermetic imagery and Hermetic logic. The sun in the Hermetic tradition had immense significance. The Emerald Tablet speaks of the operation of the sun. Paracelsus and the correspondence tradition had placed the sun at the heart of natural philosophy. Bruno's cosmology was not simply observation and calculation. It was, in part, a Hermetic vision of the universe as a living, unified, magical whole. The Inquisition noticed. The charges against Bruno were multiple, philosophical and theological, and the precise weight given to each in his condemnation has been debated by historians ever since. Francis Yates, the great 20th century scholar of the Hermetic tradition, argued controversially that Bruno's Hermeticism, not merely his cosmology, was central to what made him dangerous in the Church's eyes. She named this the Yates thesis, and it remains debated. Some historians, including Robert Westman and Brian Vickers, have pushed back, arguing that his astronomical and theological claims were more central to his condemnation than his magic. The debate has not been fully resolved. Scholars still argue. But this much is documented. Giordano Bruno, fervent Hermeticist, was burned at the stake by the Roman Inquisition in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome in 1600. The tradition was not without cost for some who carried it. Rest a moment here, gently. Let that settle. This is history, not a story. It happened, and it is worth honoring the weight of it without dramatizing it beyond what the record says. A man held certain ideas, including Hermetic ones, and died for some combination of those ideas. The exact weighting is still being worked out by historians. What is not in dispute is that he believed, and that his belief included the idea that the universe was animated by a divine principle, that the human mind participated in that principle, that nature was full of hidden correspondences waiting to be read. This is the worldview. Now, before we examine what it looked like in practice, and it was not merely philosophical, it was practical. People used it. Consider what correspondence meant as a working framework for medicine and for science before the mechanical worldview took over. The doctrine of signatures held that the appearance of a plant signaled its medicinal use. A plant with red sap might treat blood conditions. A walnut resembling a brain in its wrinkled interior might benefit the mind. A plant shaped like a liver might address liver complaints. This was not superstition in a vacuum. It was a specific application of the Hermetic principle that the macrocosm and the microcosm mirror one another, that signatures, visible signs, connected the form of a thing to its cosmic function, as above, so below, as the large, so the small, as the shape, so the purpose. Astrology operated on the same logic. The planets corresponded to metals, Saturn to lead, Jupiter to tin, Mars to iron, Venus to copper, Mercury to quicksilver, the moon to silver, the sun to gold. The same correspondences extended to days of the week, to hours, to organs in the body, to plants, to colors. A physician working within this framework was not being primitive. They were applying what they believed to be a coherent, unified theory of the universe. A theory in which everything was connected by the principle of correspondence, and in which knowing those correspondences was the key to working with nature rather than against it. Paracelsus stood in this tradition completely. Born in 1493, dying in 1541, the radical physician who reshaped early modern medicine and chemistry, who rejected Galenic medicine, who worked directly with minerals and chemical preparations, who wrote in the vernacular rather than in the Latin of university physicians, was a Hermetic thinker through and through. He saw the human body as a microcosm, a small world, and he believed that understanding the chemistry of the cosmos and the chemistry of the body were not separate inquiries. They were the same inquiry at different scales. His influence on the development of what would eventually become chemistry and pharmacology was real and lasting. And it was inseparable from the Hermetic frame within which he worked. This is one of the stranger and more beautiful things about the tradition we are tracing tonight. The correspondence principle was not merely decorative, it was generative. It led people to look for connections between the heavens and the earth, between the body and the cosmos, between one domain and another. Some of those connections, tested over time, proved to be real in ways that survived the later mechanization of science. Others did not. But the habit of looking, the expectation that hidden correspondences exist and can be found, was itself a kind of intellectual disposition that the Hermetic tradition cultivated. There is a word you use in daily life that carries the alchemist's name without most people knowing it. Hermetic, as in hermetically sealed, as in airtight, completely closed, nothing in, nothing out. The word comes from the alchemical tradition, specifically from the idea of a hermetic seal, a way of sealing a glass vessel that was attributed to the art of Hermes the alchemist. When alchemists were working with volatile substances, they needed their flasks and retorts sealed against loss of vapor. The method they credited to Hermes' tradition gave us the phrase, and the phrase entered everyday language so thoroughly that now we use it, hermetically sealed, hermetically closed, utterly shut, with no thought at all of the ancient tradition behind it. Hermes, in that small way, is in the language. He has always been there. Breathe slowly now, the room is quiet. Whatever sounds are around you, and the hum of something distant, the small movements of the night, let them be part of the stillness rather than apart from it. You do not need to follow every thread, the narration will hold them. You can simply let the words pass through. Now let us come to the pair of figures who sit at the apparent divide between the magical world and the scientific one, and who turn out, when you look closely, not to be divided at all. Robert Boyle is often called the father of modern chemistry. He articulated the idea of chemical elements, worked with gases, designed careful experiments, and thought rigorously about matter in ways that would be recognizable to a modern scientist. He was also a serious student of alchemy. He corresponded with alchemists, conducted alchemical experiments, and believed, or at least seriously entertained the belief, that the transmutation of metals was possible. And Isaac Newton, the one who described gravity, who laid the mathematical foundations for classical mechanics, whose Principia Mathematica is one of the monuments of human thought. Isaac Newton wrote more words on alchemy than on physics. This is the documented reality, not an exaggeration. His manuscripts, purchased at auction in 1936 by the economist John Maynard Keynes, who was startled by what he found, run to hundreds of thousands of words on alchemical and theological topics. Keynes, after reading them, called Newton something that has been quoted ever since. Not the first great scientist, he said, but the last of the magicians. Newton translated the Emerald Tablet into English himself. The manuscript survives. His version, careful, precise, the handwriting of the same mind that calculated the orbits of planets, begins with the words, "'Tis true, without lying, certain and most true." He copied it. He thought about it. He returned to it. The man who explained the motion of the heavens found something in this small, ancient paragraph worth his most careful attention. The historians Lawrence Principe and William Newman have written about this period with great care, and what they have established is important. The word we use, alchemy, was not cleanly split from what we now call chemistry until well after Newton's death. The practice they called chemistry, as that was their word, a blend that did not yet carry the sharp division we impose today, was a single inquiry into matter, transformation, and the hidden workings of nature. Newton was not doing two different things when he worked on the Principia and when he worked on alchemy. He was, in his own mind, working on the same thing. The clean line between science and magic is something later generations drew. Newton did not draw it. Boyle did not draw it. Paracelsus certainly did not draw it. The Hermetic tradition was not, for most of European history, clearly on one side of a divide. It was woven into the inquiry itself. This should perhaps alter slightly the story we often tell about how modern science emerged. The Hermetic worldview, with its expectation of hidden order, its confidence that nature has discoverable secret laws, its orientation toward correspondence and analogy as investigative tools, may have been one of the psychological conditions that made the scientific revolution possible. At least some historians have argued so. Francis Yates argued it most boldly. Others have pushed back. And the debate is real. We should not overstate it. But we should not too quickly dismiss it either. Let the question rest in you quietly. It is the kind of question that does not need to be resolved tonight. And now we come to the resolution of a loop that has been open since early in the evening. We said that the Renaissance believed Hermes Trismegistus was a contemporary of Moses, that the Siena floor showed him in marble, labeled so, that Ficino placed him first before Plato, that an entire worldview rested on the assumption that these were the oldest texts, the closest to the source, the most sacred. In 1614, a Protestant scholar named Isaac Casaubon sat down with the Greek text of the Corpus Hermeticum and read it the way a philologist reads a text, mystically, not reverently, carefully, looking at the vocabulary, the grammar, the references, the idiom. And he noticed something. The Greek was not archaic. It was not the Greek of ancient Egypt, of Ptolemaic scribes, of priests who might have written in the time of Moses. It was the Greek of the early Christian centuries, the idiom, the philosophical vocabulary, the specific terms. They placed the texts in the 1st through 3rd centuries of the Common Era. Not before Plato. After Plato, not before Christ. After Christ. Not ancient in the sense the Renaissance had meant. Not pharaonic, not primal. The Corpus Hermeticum, Casaubon concluded, was composed roughly 1400 or 1500 years later than people believed. He published his findings in a work called De Rebus Sacris et Ecclesiasticis Exercitationes in the year 1614. It is a landmark of historical philology, the discipline of reading texts carefully to determine when and where and by whom they were written. His argument was sound, and it has been confirmed and refined by modern scholarship ever since. The Corpus Hermeticum dates to the 1st through 3rd centuries CE. It is a product of Roman Egypt, of Hellenistic Alexandria, of a moment when Greek philosophy and Egyptian religious thought and early Christian ideas were all in contact with one another. It is a remarkable product of that moment, but it is not older than Plato, it is not older than Moses, it is not the primal revelation. This could have destroyed the tradition. It did not. There is something quietly instructive about that. The Hermetic tradition survived the demolition of its founding claim. Casaubon showed that the texts were not what they had been thought to be, and the tradition continued, because the ideas had taken root, because the correspondence principle had been absorbed into medicine, into astrology, into natural philosophy, into art and architecture, and the decorative programs of cathedrals. You do not easily remove something that has grown into the structure of thought itself. And the emerald tablet itself was not even the subject of Casaubon's critique. The tablet, remember, is distinct from the Corpus Hermeticum. Its earliest form is Arabic, from perhaps the 8th or 9th century. It had travelled a different path. It had entered Latin thought through the Secretum Secretorum and other medieval channels. Its dating was not what Casaubon addressed. His focus was the Greek philosophical corpus, the 17 treatises with their dialogues between Hermes and his disciples Tat and Asclepius and Ammon. The tablet continued to circulate after 1614, continued to be copied and commented upon, continued to inspire. Newton's translation came after Casaubon. He knew, or could have known, that the ancient dating of the corpus had been challenged, and he still copied out the tablet, still wrote "'Tis true" without lying, certain and most true in his careful hand. The demolition of the founding myth did not for him end the inquiry. Take a slow breath. Let yourself settle a little deeper into wherever you are. We are close to the end of the night's journey now. But there is one more thing, one more layer to the story that belongs here because it answers a question you may have been holding for most of the evening. If you have encountered Hermeticism in a modern context, in books about the occult, in spiritual communities, in popular writing about ancient wisdom, you have almost certainly encountered the 7 Hermetic principles. They are quoted everywhere. They are presented as the core of an ancient system. They appear in lists, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, gender. The first one declares that the all is mind, that the universe is mental in nature. The second is the one we have been tracing all evening, as above, so below, as below, so above. The third says that nothing rests, that everything moves and vibrates. The fourth, that everything is dual, that everything has poles. The fifth, that everything flows, that everything has its tides. The sixth, that every cause has its effect, and every effect its cause. The seventh, that gender is in everything, that everything has its masculine and feminine principles. 7 laws, stated with the authority of deep antiquity. Usually introduced as the wisdom of ancient Egypt and Greece, the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus recovered from the oldest layers of the tradition. They are not ancient. They were written in Chicago in 1908 in a book called The Kybalion, subtitled A Study of the Hermetic Philosophy of Ancient Egypt and Greece. The authors identified themselves on the cover as 3 initiates. They did not give their names. The presentation, 3 anonymous initiates passing along ancient teachings, was itself part of the mystique, part of the claim of ancient transmission. Scholars who have studied the book have attributed it, with considerable confidence, to a man named William Walker Atkinson. Atkinson was a prolific writer, a figure in the New Thought movement of late 19th and early 20th century America, a movement that emphasized the power of mind, positive thinking, and mental laws as governing principles of experience. He wrote under many pseudonyms: Yogi Ramacharaka, Theron Q. Dumont, and apparently 3 initiates. The 7 principles as a 7-fold list do not appear in the ancient Hermetica. They are not in the Corpus Hermeticum. They are not in the Asclepius. They are not in the Emerald Tablet. They are a 1908 American synthesis built on genuine Hermetic themes. Correspondence is genuinely ancient, and mentalism has real resonance with the corpus's presentation of God as nous, as divine mind, as the source from which the cosmos emanated, but repackaged and reformulated in the idiom of new thought and presented with a false claim of ancient pedigree. This is the central surprise of the tradition as it has actually traveled. The most quoted version of it is the most recent. The lines that feel most like timeless lore were written in a Chicago office by a man with many names in the same decade that the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. And yet, the Kybalion, built on something real. Atkinson, or the 3 initiates, whatever name we give them, read the tradition and distilled from it principles that do have genuine roots. The correspondence principle is ancient. The idea that God, or the all, is mind, that the cosmos is, in some sense, a mental emanation, is genuinely present in the Corpus Hermeticum. The Kybalion is not a fabrication out of nothing. Its error is the claim, the framing, the presentation as ancient in a literal historical sense. The content is a reinterpretation, not a discovery. It belongs to a long tradition of reinterpretation that is itself part of what Hermeticism is. This is the pattern the whole evening has traced. The Corpus Hermeticum was not written in pharaonic Egypt. It was written in Roman Egypt, but it drew on Egyptian and Greek and Platonic themes and wove them into something new. The Emerald Tablet was not inscribed on a slab of green stone by a god-king at the dawn of time. It emerged in Arabic-speaking lands in the early medieval centuries, but it spoke to something so fundamental, the unity behind multiplicity, the mirroring of above and below, that it was absorbed into Latin Christianity and alchemical practice, and became, for practical purposes, one of the most commented upon short texts in the Western tradition. The Kybalion was not a recovered ancient document. It was a 1908 American book, but it found millions of readers who recognized something in it worth keeping. The tradition reinvents itself. That is not a weakness. It may be part of what makes it last. There is something to be said in the quiet of tonight for a tradition that absorbs and reshapes and re-emerges, that refuses to be definitively located, that attaches itself to new hands and new languages and new centuries, and goes on. Not because it is literally what it claims to be, but because whatever it is reaching toward, the intuition that things correspond, that a hidden order underlies appearance, that the human mind participates in the same principles that govern the cosmos, keeps finding people ready to receive it. Rest here for a moment. Notice, if you would like to, the simple fact of your own breathing, in and out, without effort, without instruction, the body doing all night what it knows to do. There is something almost hermetic in that. The macrocosm breathes the ancients' thought in its rhythms and cycles and tides, and the microcosm, you breathing here, breathes with it, not because we can verify the metaphysics of it, but because the image is a kind of rest, a reminder that you are not separate from the large things. You are a small version of them, and they are a large version of you, and the line between where you end and the universe begins is, tonight, in the dark, at this hour, not entirely clear. The Hermetic tradition went on after the Kybalion. It goes on still. In the early 17th century, mysterious documents circulated in Germany announcing the existence of a secret brotherhood called the Rosicrucians. Keepers, the documents claimed, of ancient wisdom, hermetic and otherwise. No one is certain the brotherhood existed in the form the documents described, but the documents caused an extraordinary stir, and the ideas they carried, a synthesis of Hermeticism, alchemy, mystical Christianity, and the hope of a coming reform of knowledge, spread through European intellectual life in ways that are still traceable. Then in 1875, a Russian woman named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky founded in New York the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky drew on an enormous range of sources, Eastern and Western, ancient and recent, and placed Hermeticism among them. The theosophical current would flow through the spiritual landscape of the late 19th century and into the 20th, and it would carry Hermetic ideas with it into new contexts, new audiences, new geographies. And in 1888 in London, a small group of scholars and occultists founded the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The name itself is a declaration, Hermetic. They were claiming the lineage explicitly. The Golden Dawn built its rituals on a synthesis of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Egyptian imagery, tarot, and astrology. It was, in some ways, the most ambitious attempt yet made to hold all of the Western esoteric streams in a single organized system, to give them initiatory structure, graded knowledge, ritual embodiment. Its members included William Butler Yeats, the poet, the Nobel laureate, the voice of Irish literary revival. Yeats was not a casual member. He was a serious and committed one, rising through the grades, deeply interested in the magical worldview the Golden Dawn offered. He wrote about it obliquely, encoded it in his poetry, used its frameworks in his private symbolism. Some of the most celebrated lines in 20th century English poetry were written by a man who believed, with genuine seriousness, in the hermetic correspondence between above and below. The Golden Dawn also briefly included Aleister Crowley, who left or was expelled. The histories differ on the precise dynamics, and went on to develop his own elaborate magical system, which drew heavily on Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Egyptian sources. Crowley is a complicated figure, celebrated by some and reviled by others, and we will not linger on him here, except to note his presence as evidence of how much creative energy the the Hermetic stream continued to generate in the early 20th century. And after all of that, the tradition is still not finished. As above, so below appears in popular culture, in tarot decks, in fantasy novels, in conversation, in the names of bands and albums and films. The Emerald Tablet is printed in dozens of languages. The Corpus Hermeticum is available in critical scholarly editions from university presses and also in paperback from bookshops that specialize in the occult. Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest, the fusion of Thoth and Hermes, the figure who may have existed nowhere except in the imagination of Hellenistic Egypt and who was nonetheless placed in stone in a cathedral floor as a contemporary of Moses, has never fully left. The word Hermetic, meaning completely sealed, is in every language that borrowed it from Latin. The tradition never died. It went underground sometimes, or into libraries, or into the language of people who no longer knew where the word came from. And then it resurfaced, as it has so many times in so many hands. Breathe slowly now. Let us gather gently what we have moved through tonight, not to memorize it, not to hold it tightly, just to let it pass through one more time, the way water moves through a place and leaves it altered in small, quiet ways. We began with Newton's hand, that careful, precise hand, the hand that calculated orbits, that wrote the Principia, copying out a single ancient paragraph. 'Tis true without lying, certain and most true. The man John Maynard Keynes called the last of the magicians, sitting at his desk with this small text that had travelled across centuries and languages to reach him. The text on the page, the mind attending to it. We move to the text itself, a single short paragraph said to have been found on a slab of green stone in the hands, sometimes in the story, in the tomb, of a being who was both man and God. The Emerald Tablet, Tabula Smaragdina, Law al-Zumurud, true without falsehood. The Father the Sun, the Mother the Moon. Separate the earth from the fire. As above, so below. We met the figure behind it, Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest, not a historical person, but a fusion, a composite formed in the meeting of two cultures in Egypt after Alexander. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods carrying the scales and the stylus, Hermes, fleet-footed messenger, guide of souls across boundaries, two deities of wisdom and writing and the crossing over between worlds, seen in the extraordinary syncretism of Hellenistic Alexandria as one. We moved through the Corpus Hermeticum, the Greek treatises of Roman Egypt, the first through 3rd centuries of the Common Era, not pharaonic Egypt, not the time of Moses, but a rich and remarkable time of their own, when the Poemandres was written, when the cosmic vision of the divine mind and the soul's ascent through the planetary spheres was set down in dialogue form between Hermes and his students, Tat and Asclepius and Ammon. We followed the tablet into its Arabic early life, its medieval Latin travel through the Secretum Secretorum, its commentary by Hortulanus, the hands that multiplied it across manuscript culture. We arrived in Florence, Cosimo de' Medici, urgent, ordering Marsilio Ficino to stop translating Plato, the Greek manuscript, the rush to complete, to print, to share. Ficino's Latin translation of 1463, printed in 1471. The belief, sincere, powerful, wrong in its chronology but extraordinary in its consequences, that these texts were older and holier than Plato. We stood in the Cathedral of Siena and looked at the floor. Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, Contemporaneus Moysi, the marble sage receiving and giving wisdom. The cathedral's devotion expressed in stone that people have walked over and around for 5 centuries. We followed the chain of hands, Pico della Mirandola opening the oration on the dignity of man with Hermes on his lips, fusing the Hermetic tradition with Kabbalah and Platonic philosophy into the declaration that the human being is a magnum miraculum, a great wonder. Giordano Bruno, burning in the Campo dei Fiori in 1600, his Hermeticism and his infinite universe inseparable from one another and from his fate. Paracelsus, the physician who never stopped believing that the body was a microcosm and that knowing the cosmos was knowing the human being. The doctrine of signatures, the correspondence between planets and metals and days and organs, the working logic of a world that had not yet been divided into science and magic. We paused at the strange beauty of the word hermetic in everyday speech, carrying the alchemist's name into conversations about jars and packages and rooms sealed against the outside air. We came to Casaubon in 1614, reading the Greek, finding in the language the signature of the early Christian centuries, dating the corpus a millennium and a half younger than the Renaissance believed. The foundational myth gently demolished, the tradition continuing anyway, and then the gentlest surprise of the evening, held back until nearly the end, the Kybalion, Chicago, 1908. 3 initiates who were almost certainly one man, William Walker Atkinson, a New Thought writer of extraordinary productivity, setting down 7 principles and presenting them as the ancient wisdom of Egypt and Greece. Mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, gender, not ancient, modern, American, built on real Hermetic themes but repackaged in the language of a different era, the way the tradition has always been repackaged by each age that received it and made it its own. And then the stream going forward, the Rosicrucians, the Theosophical Society in 1875, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in 1888, Yeats writing poems that encoded what he had learned in the initiation grades, the tradition dispersing into popular culture, into tarot and fantasy and everyday speech, into the phrase you might say tomorrow without knowing who you are quoting. You do not need to remember any of it. If one image stayed, Newton's hand, the green stone, the Florence manuscript, the marble sage in the Siena floor, the 3 nameless initiates in Chicago, let that image be enough. The rest is still here. It will be here tomorrow. The texts are in libraries and in digital archives and in the patient hands of scholars who spend their lives with them. The tradition is not going anywhere. What you carry, if you carry anything, is simply this: that a very small text, barely a dozen sentences, true without falsehood, certain and most true, somehow mattered enough to be copied in Arabic in the medieval centuries, to be rendered into Latin, to be commented upon by medieval scholars, to be sent westward through the Secretum Secretorum, to reach Newton's desk and receive his careful translation, to be absorbed into the thinking of physicians and artists and philosophers and poets, and to still be recognizable tonight, centuries after most of the people who copied it are dust. There is something in that persistence worth resting with, not as proof of anything, not as argument, just as the fact of it. People kept finding something here, generation after generation, something worth preserving, worth copying, worth losing sleep over. Tonight you have kept them company, very gently, for a few hours in the dark. The stars, if you could see them, are doing whatever they do, whether we name them or not. The mind, as the Poimandres suggests in its ancient way, moves in its own immense cycles. And you are here, small and particular and actual, breathing in the quiet, the weight of the night around you, the body knowing without instruction what to do. That is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep well, be wise in the simplest way there is tonight, and rest.